Hi, I'm Judith Yarrow and here I am in my studio in Shipping Norton in the basement of our house. It's on a slope so it leads out to the garden and this is where I work. I'm sitting where I normally work. So if you watch the next video which is a virtual tour of the exhibition that I would have put on for Art Weeks, you'll see more of the studio and my work, and I talk more about my work there. So here I'll just briefly give you a little bit about the influences on my work and how I work. We've lived here for 30 years, for just over 30 years, when our youngest child, we've got 4, was just 1, and I've been doing Art Weeks for 20 years now, with a couple of years off as breaks for various reasons. Last year our daughter had a baby in Art Weeks, so that was why I didn't do it last year. I'm a mixed media landscape painter, and I mostly paint remote and atmospheric places, mountains, the coast, places that I walk to often because walking is part of my work, I would say. And they're normally places I know quite well, or where we know friends and we have family. So there are reasons that we go back to these places and get to know them more intimately. I like to paint fleeting moments, and the light and the dark often feature in my work. I love the poem by R.S. Thomas called The Bright Field, and the couple of lines that go, "I have seen the sun break through to illuminate a small field for a while." I like the way the weather over a day changes a landscape, and how a landscape never looks the same. It's been there for thousands of years and there's something quite eternal about it, but it's forever changing. I like to experiment, and I use lots of different materials, mixed media, and I also do bookmaking and printmaking. I'll talk about the materials in a little bit. So the 3 main influences on my work, I would say, are walking, making, and family and friends and the places where they live. First of all, I'd like to say a little bit about where my art comes from. I try to access what it is that makes me who I am and the way I see the world and life, and finding an inner still space, something quite intangible to work from, which isn't always easy in life and can be very hard to find. The winter, I find, is an easier time to paint, but the summer is a good time to do sketchbook work and to paint outside. So walking, first of all, wild, remote places, and there are different types of walking which I'm exploring in my most recent work that I'm in the middle of doing, which is an everyday walks book around Shipping Norton, and that sort of walking, the sort of walking we're doing at the moment with the coronavirus here, only being allowed 1 short walk a day, but they can be walks that can be contemplative and meditative and very mindful, observing closely what you see and looking for the small changes. Especially at the moment, coming into spring, there's something different to see every day. There are other types of walks. There's trekking, where you go point to point and you walk every day, all day, for a week or 2 or 3, and that's a lovely type of walking that I've done a lot of in mountains all over the world, but I still prefer the ones in this country because I know them. And then there are the walks you do perhaps at the weekend when you might do a longer walk, again, perhaps with friends. But the sort of walking that my book's about is this very everyday sort of walk you might do with a dog, or you might do if you're recovering from an illness, or as a break from your everyday work, perhaps at a desk, for example. I was brought up in Jordans in Buckinghamshire, a small village that was built by a group of Quakers in the 1920s, and we lived in one of the village houses round the village green that was rented. It's in the Chilterns, and there are lots of beech trees and trees. You don't get far views. And we had one holiday a year then in the 50s and the 60s, and we often went to Wales. We often went to Pembrokeshire near St David's, and we'd have 2 weeks there in June. And I loved the open spaces that you got. We rented a bungalow on the coast with views out across to St David's Head, and in the evening and at night you'd see the lighthouses distantly, and the islands of Ramsey. And the island of Ramsey and the smaller ones as well. The Bishops and Clarks, are they? Anyway, that gave me a sense of what it is to have a far horizon and to have that open space, which I love so much to paint. I've also got interested in the small islands that surround Britain. Again, going back to those childhood holidays where we used to visit Ramsey and Skomer, and I've returned in recent years and done work on those islands. Also Rathlin off the north coast of Northern Ireland, and all the Scottish islands, especially Cole and Mull. And I did a residency on Shetland and also Orkney, and then the further northern islands of Iceland and the Faroe Islands. There's something about that northern light that is very beautiful. So I like to look across from a coast or across a landscape from a mountain top or a ridge, and that great sense of openness. Now, the second influence has been making. I've always really loved to make things with my hands from a small child, and using books. I remember 2 books particularly, a book called Something to Do and another one called The Rainy Day Book, which were full of fantastic makes with paper and cotton reels and printing with vegetables, things you could just find around, and ways to be creative with what you had. Again, I then trained as a primary school teacher in Cambridge at Homerton College, and you have to be resourceful as a teacher and use materials, experiment with how you can use them and what's available, and I still think I use that in my work. I like to experiment and use a variety of materials. I like to have a theme to my work. I like to do a body of work and really get into a place, perhaps particularly, and then I like to bring that body of work into a book, an artist's book, which I make, often sewing them together, and sometimes printmaking for for what's inside. I like the way it's a 3D object. You make it with your hands. It's a very direct connection with materials, and they can be folded and hung, like one behind me. And you can be inventive. You can put them in boxes. You can tie them up. They become sculptural almost. So the way I paint is in layers. I like to use texture, different types of papers, perhaps canvas stuck on the baseboard, and I use acrylic paints and oil paints and pastels, oil and soft pastels, pencils, charcoal, watercolour, collage of different types, perhaps old prints I've done, which I haven't used but can be torn up for interesting textures, for example. and I'll work one layer, and then I might use resist as well, or I might scratch into it, or spatter paint or spray paint. I just like to experiment. So every painting is different. I don't have a set way of doing it. I start afresh each time. I went back to college to do art when the youngest of our children was about 3, to the Mid Warwickshire College in Leamington Spa, and I did a part-time diploma course and then a fine art degree that they did there. And they had a particularly good print making department, and that's when I got interested in that. Now I've just got a small press at home, and I use techniques that I can use at home, like dry point, for example. I've also done some collages using torn pictures from magazines for more dreamscape idylls. You'll find out more about the way I work from the virtual studio video I've done. So the third influence is family and friends. I'm the oldest of 5, and we've had 4 children, and now we've got grandchildren. So it's always been a question of juggling and trying to find the time, but also the family particularly, and what's happened in my life has been an influence on my work, and I've used it particularly in my bookmaking. For example, our mother had Alzheimer's disease, and I've done a book to do with her experience of that, based on a poem which she wrote, and using images from the very good nursing home where she was at the very end of her life. And 4 years ago I was diagnosed with breast cancer, and I've done a book to do with my experience of radiotherapy. So a bicycle ride with a very good friend, and our 2 daughters who are good friends, was the subject of another book, for example. I like the way that a book can be quite intimate, the way you hold it, and it makes the work more accessible, I think. Recently my work has been closer to home, partly because I get much tireder, I think partly because of the medication I'm on. So I've been concentrating recently on an area in Chipping Norton behind the school and the leisure centre called Glyme Lane that goes, it's a track, a very ancient track that goes up past the allotments and the Millennium Wood and past where we keep our bees to the farm up there. And I with a friend, Crabby Taylor, have been exploring that every week. On a Tuesday we meet at 8 in the morning and we go out and we draw and paint in situ, and that's been a really fantastic experience. We've built up a body of work. That area is under threat from a proposed relief road, so we wanted to highlight what would be lost if that goes ahead. So the type of walks that we're doing at the moment, while we're in lockdown with only allowed to do a walk a day, are the type of walks that I'm exploring, as I was saying at the beginning, in this book that I'm doing prints for. And that's the work I'm actively involved with at the moment and enjoying very much. It's local, and I've now got the space and the time to actually do it. The sort of artists I'm often asked that have influenced me, I think you take something from every artist really, but artists that I particularly like, perhaps at the moment, the Scottish artist, contemporary one, Victoria Crow, whose a retrospective exhibition I saw recently in Edinburgh, where my sister lives and my son as well at the moment, on a visit there, was wonderfully inspiring her. And then there's Joan Erdley, an older Scottish painter, wonderful textured landscapes. Winifred Nicholson, I love her calm, I suppose, and the way she abstracts from the landscape a sense of light and quiet. And Gwen John, again, her contemplative quietness that she gets in her paintings. And then there's Elizabeth Vellicott, again quiet, particularly her drawings are wonderful. The first artist that I knew was Samuel Palmer, because we did a school trip from Buckinghamshire to Oxford to the Ashmolean, where they have those wonderful sepia drawings he did at night, and they really had a deep influence on me, that atmosphere and the landscape and the detail. And then there's Stanley Spencer, who's also the most local artist to Jordan's, and we used to sometimes go and visit the little gallery in Cookham. So that's probably the very first art I ever saw. And again, although he's a quirky artist, his landscapes and the detail of the local landscape around Cookham and the fields there are just wonderful, the intricacies. And then there are others. There's Peter Doig, a contemporary artist whose work I love, and Revilius, of course. At the moment, I'm thinking particularly of him. There was an exhibition at Compton Verney last year, I think it was, which was fantastic. And Ivan Hitchens, I've recently seen an exhibition of his, which was at the Pallant Gallery in Chichester. That was a wonderful exhibition too. Anyway, I hope that's given you an idea of where my work comes from. It's trying to access what it is that makes me who I am and the way I see the world and life, finding an inner still space, something really intangible. Thank you for listening, and I hope you'll go on to have a look at the virtual tour that I've done another video of. Bye bye for now. Thank you.